A storm was raging through Pine Hollow that night when Jack Turner and his loyal K9 Ranger disappeared into the forest. What made a quiet man, a broken soldier, walk straight into the darkest part of the woods? Why was there a child's pink backpack lying in the mud? And why did Ranger stop? Ears up, body trembling, like he'd heard something no one else could. In that storm, beneath the whispering pines, they would discover a secret buried at the edge of a cliff. A truth that would test every ounce of courage they had and forge a bond that could heal more than one broken soul. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The storm came hard and fast, drumming on roofs, making the pines bow like old saints, turning the dirt streets of Pine Hollow into slick ribbons of shadow. Wind clawed at shutters. The sky was the color of steel about to break. Jack Turner heard the weather before he truly saw it. Sound found him in the small, dim cabin at the town's edge. The steady hiss of rain, the metallic clack of a wind-tossed latch, the far percussion of thunder rolling over the mountains. He sat at his scarred workbench under the soft cone of a yellow lamp, a man shaped by winters and wars, by long hours under cars and longer hours under silence. 45, rangy from labor and habit, shoulders a little bowed from years of carrying what couldn't be set down. His hair was hazel brown and cut close by necessity, not style. At the temples, a frost of silver marked time's slow advance. A short beard framed a mouth that had forgotten how to talk too much. It was neatly kept, but not fussy, salt threading the darker growth at the chin. His face had the careful geometry of someone who measures rooms and exits without admitting he's doing it. High cheekbones, straight nose, a little crooked near the bridge from a long ago impact, a jaw that locked when worry came, which was often. He wore a dark flannel shirt rolled to the forearms, a faded gray t-shirt beneath, jeans with the honest stains of oil and red dust, and boots whose creases read like maps. Ranger lay on the braided rug by the door, the German shepherd whose presence made the house feel less like a place and more like a post. 7 years old, and in the bright center of his prime, he carried the black and tan of his lineage like a uniform, a deep saddle of black down the back, tan legs corded with muscle, a chest built for sprinting and stopping on command. His muzzle had just the faintest ash at the whiskers, a promise of years rather than a loss of them, and his eyes were amber coins that caught light and judgment both. He had the heavy-shouldered grace of a working dog, the kind that memorizes a handler's breathing, the kind that settles only when a human's heartbeat does. Even at rest, his ears did their small arithmetic with the night. The radio on Jack's shelf coughed to life. It was the old emergency band he kept because some things you never surrender. The habit of the nightly check-in. The brief comfort of knowing which sirens were yours and which belonged to another town. Static scratched the room, then a voice carried by duty rather than warmth. The dispatcher, a woman with the plain-spoken cadence of someone who has learned to say terrible things gently. Be advised, missing juvenile. Female, 8 years old. Last seen Maple Street, approximately 1850 hours, wearing a pink raincoat. Name, Emma Collins. The syllables of the child's name hit Jack like a small, precise blow. Not the way a rifle cracked the air or a roadside blast folded a street. It was quieter and more treacherous, slipping past his guard and lodging in the delicate machinery of memory. He didn't move at first. He watched a bead of rain snake down the window, the glass cool and trembling, and he breathed in the cabin's familiar scents: machine oil, pine cleaner, wet wool, the dog's clean musk. In his head, doors swung open that he had tried to keep closed. He saw Kabul at noon and Kandahar at dawn, a market where voices braided with the clatter of tin, the road where a convoy had slowed. The moment routine became rupture. He heard a voice like a bell, clear, high, and stubbornly alive, belonging to a girl with a red kite he had promised to guide to safety. In that memory, the air thickened, turning grainy with suspended dust. The color drained from his hands, just as it had then. He swallowed. Ranger lifted his head, ears pricked. The dog didn't growl, because growling was for warnings, and Ranger was beyond warnings. His body went still, the way a bowstring holds still just before it throws. Jack's eyes slid from the rain-beaded window to the dog, and the calm that combat had ruined and labor had partly restored came back to him, clean and immediate. "What is it, Bud?" he asked. But it wasn't a question that expected words. Ranger rose without a sound, that big, taut body unfolding with grace, paws ticking once against the wood. He faced the door. He breathed in, long and deliberate, and his rib cage lifted like a tide. Something outside had arranged itself into meaning. Jack stood, the lamp's light peeling down his shirt front. There were people in Pine Hollow who would call him quiet, others who would call him standoffish. Both were true, and neither was an indictment. War had salted his humor and tempered his kindness. He liked people best when they were fixing something side by side: fences, engines, the crowbar straight hinge on the back gate of the church. He had learned to keep his hands busy as a way to keep his mind from digging up the fields he had already harvested to exhaustion. But some habits of service refuse retirement. He took his jacket from the nail by the door. It was the heavy canvas kind, clean in the way things get clean when you wear them hard and wash them soft. Scuffed elbows, repaired seam at the cuff done by his own neat, blunt stitches. He slid into it and felt its weight, as if permission had settled across his shoulders. He checked the pockets by touch. Pen light, small tin with waterproof matches, folded triangle bandage in plastic, the cheap compass that told true enough to get you out and back. He buckled on a belt pouch with a tourniquet and a trauma dressing, because hope should travel with preparation. He took a flashlight from the bench, aluminum-bodied, knurled, its lens clean and its battery fat with charge, and he tested its beam against the floorboards. The light cut a blade through dust motes and struck the door in one bright coin. Ranger was already at heel, head tilted, waiting for the word that meant the world would narrow and become simple. Jack bent and pressed his forehead briefly to the dog's crown. Not sentiment, but ritual. They had a few like that, small gestures that reset the clock inside both of them. "With me," he said, and the dog's muscles set as neatly as a lock, finding its key. The storm pressed at the door like a stranger deciding whether to knock or force entry. Jack stepped out. Rain took him in a full-body handshake, cold and authoritative. The yard shone under the flood of the porch light, the truck squatting by the workshop like a loyal ox. Across the gravel lane the pines rose, black and interlaced, their needles whispering not words, but the suggestion of them. Pine Hollow smelled of wet bark and diesel, of distant wood smoke where someone, unwisely or unavoidably, had a stove going. Jack's boots met the earth and slid a half inch, then bit. Ranger's claws found purchase with that tactile precision dogs have, 4 points reading a map people only half comprehend. Radio's got her last seen on Maple, Jack said, as if the dog needed the context. What he really needed was to say it to the air, to promise he was heading where the sentence pointed. He locked the cabin and palmed the key into the jacket's inner pocket. He didn't think about why he didn't toss it into the dish like he always did. He didn't think about the superstition of it. The road into town presented itself in segments between trees, a slice of wet black, a glare of someone's porch light, a reflective sign that read, Speed 25, and meant nothing to rain or fear. 2 blocks down, a cruiser idled with its lights turning the rain into red-blue beads, a rosary of urgency. Jack lifted 2 fingers to the deputy inside, a young man whose face looked half fashioned by worry and half by caffeine, and the deputy nodded back, grateful to see any pair of hands with purpose attached. Jack did not stop to trade the useless currency of reassurances. He angled left onto Maple. The houses here were the square-shouldered kind, modest and honest. Porches with swings that squeaked on humid nights, and matting that read, Welcome even when life did not. A pink bicycle lay against a hedge as if sleep had overtaken it mid-errand. The sight hitch-knotted something in Jack's chest. He swallowed again. Not sadness. Not yet. Something earlier on the map. Resolve crossing with alarm. Ranger's nose stirred the air. The dog's head turned like a compass needle with a magnet nearby. He tugged once, not undisciplined, just insistent, toward the narrow lane that ran behind the houses, where trash bins waited like patient soldiers and chain-link fences rattled under the wind's hand. Jack angled the beam along asphalt, up the skirt of a hedge, into the gape of an open gate, along the shadow seam, where lawn became alley. There, a small scuff in the dark topcoat where something slid, then a smear on the concrete lip of a storm drain that might have been mud but looked too brown, too humane. He didn't kneel. The ground was a slick liar tonight. He crouched and put his gloved fingers near, but not in the mark, and Ranger inhaled it, slow, committed. The dog's body changed. It wasn't dramatic. It was a click within a click, a mechanism arming inside muscle and mind. The tail lowered to a line, the ears pricked to a pitch that seemed to hear his own heartbeat, and the head came forward at a deliberate angle. Track, Jack said, his voice quiet, because quiet felt like the right respect to pay to whatever moment came next. Ranger moved, not wild, not a sprint, a glide with traction. He drew Jack down the alley and out to the service road, across a shallow flood where gutter met gravel and the water stacked up like sheets, then right along the fence behind the old lumber yard, whose sign, Morris and Sons, had lost the ampersand and pretended to be plural some other way. Jack kept the beam low and steady, an old trick, high light blinds, low light informs, and he kept his breathing slow and regular because Ranger took orders from his chest as much as his mouth. The missing girl's name threaded through his mind with the persistence of a hymn. Emma Collins, 8 years old, pink raincoat. The radio had not given height or weight, but his head did what heads do. It filled in from things seen in grocery store lines. In the shadowed schoolyard, you pass without intending to look, in the way a small arm fits into a sleeve when helped, the oval of a child's face framed by wet hair. He shook his head once to clear the presumption. You follow the sign you have, not the picture you want. Memory tried one more trick. It showed him a different street, where the lights were square and hard and unblinking. where a crowd made of dust and warnings had folded itself into walls, where the map had been drawn by men who had already decided where paths would end. He tasted iron the way a body does when adrenaline whispers its early promise. "Not tonight," he said, and the words were a spell cast over himself as much as a fact spoken to air. Then, through rain, the faintest ghost of a color, wrong against the palette of storm and pine, a blush of pink near a chain-link breach where the fence had given up and made a crooked mouth. He went low and angled the light. A small rectangle of nylon, torn loose from a zipper tab, clung to the fence by one thread. It was the gray beaded kind rain makes almost pretty. He let the beam linger, then cut it and listened. The whole town seemed to be made of rain and breath. Ranger didn't wait for permission to affirm. He sniffed, then gave a soft, contained whine, the kind of sound that means the track has changed from possibility to claim. "Good," Jack said, and with that one word, he let the old machinery spin up. The way he placed his feet so they would carry weight without noise. The way he scanned both near and far in tidy sweeps. The way he used the corner of his eye. Because sometimes the thing you need will not survive a direct look. At the far end of the fence, the trees gathered tighter, closer to what locals called the green belt, and what Jack's mind, trained to taxonomies of risk, called concealment. The world down there narrowed. Brush leaned into itself. Thorns made entitlement claims. The rain took on that whisper change that means the canopy has started to speak for it. Ranger slipped through the fence's mouth and into the green. Jack followed, the wire kissing his jacket with a rasp that sounded loud and then was gone. The town smeared behind them and then ceased. Ahead, the forest opened its small, usable paths, and the storm breathed different, less like a wall and more like a living thing you had to learn to move with. Jack lifted his light, and Ranger lifted his head, and the two of them, the quiet man and the dog who read his heart, stepped into the dark together. The rescue had not yet begun, not in the clean sense that later makes for easy stories, but the first true step had been taken, and somewhere ahead, beneath pines that bowed and listened, a child's name waited to be answered. Rain fell harder as the forest thickened, pounding on wet leaves like an unrelenting drumbeat. Mist rose from the earth in thin white breaths, wrapping the undergrowth in a cold, damp shroud. Somewhere far off, thunder rumbled low, as if the night itself were warning them not to keep going. Jack Turner moved carefully, boots sinking into the mud, his flashlight carving a shaky ribbon of light through the dark. His breath came in even, quiet pulls, though inside him something was beginning to twist, an instinct he thought he'd buried with the war. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the sharpened awareness of a man who had been in places where darkness meant ambush and silence meant something was waiting. Ranger trotted ahead, shoulders rolling like a well-oiled machine, fur darkened by rain. The German shepherd lowered his head, nose skimming the slick earth, moving with that unwavering precision Jack had learned to trust more than his own eyes. Water clung to the dog's thick coat, but he didn't flinch. He belonged in the cold, in the storm, in the in-between spaces where men hesitated. The beam of Jack's flashlight caught something, a dull, wet glimmer on the ground. He crouched, the mud seeping cold through the knees of his jeans. A child's backpack lay there, heavy with water, one strap twisted like it had been ripped or dragged. The pink fabric had darkened to a bruised rose under the rain, but the embroidered name was still visible beneath the droplets. Emma Collins. The air around Jack seemed to tighten. For a moment, he didn't move, just stared at the letters as if they had the power to bend time backward. His hand closed around the strap slowly, like he was picking up something that could shatter. When the wet canvas pressed against his palm, he felt the chill crawl into his bones. This was no longer just a missing child call. This was a trail, a hunt, and hunts had endings, good or bad. Easy, he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. Ranger circled back, sniffing at the ground beside the backpack. He gave a low sound, not a bark or a growl, but the kind of soft, vibrating note that meant certainty. The dog moved toward the tree line ahead, where the forest grew denser, shadows gathering like a waiting crowd. Jack followed the line of the drag marks. Two parallel grooves carved deep into the mud, cutting through wet leaves and broken twigs. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't clean. Emma hadn't just wandered. She had been taken or carried. His pulse thudded hard in his throat. He straightened slowly, backpack still in hand. His thumb brushed against the damp zipper. It was small, decorated with a cheap plastic charm of a white unicorn. It caught the flashlight beam for a second, a brief, fragile gleam in the storm. Jack's jaw tightened. He knew this forest. Whispering Hollow. A stretch of woods that most locals avoided after dark, not because of ghosts, though the old stories loved to say so, but because something real had happened here 15 years ago. A teenage boy had gone missing during a summer storm just like this one. His bike was found in the mud. His body never was. People stopped talking about it eventually, the way small towns bury horror beneath gossip and pie sales. But Jack had never forgotten. He wasn't a local back then, just a young soldier home on leave. But the headline had stuck to his mind like burrs. He stared deeper into the trees. The hollow seemed to breathe differently. Rain softened there, but the shadows grew thicker. Even the storm seemed reluctant to trespass too far. Jack slid the backpack over his shoulder. It hung heavier than it should have. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "Let's finish what somebody else didn't." Ranger moved forward, low and silent, following the tracks. Jack followed in step, scanning the dark like a sniper watching a ridge. He kept the light low, the way he'd learned overseas. The enemy sees light before it sees you. And here, though no rifle was pointed at him, that same instinct wrapped itself around his ribs like old barbed wire. A branch snapped somewhere up ahead. Jack froze, flashlight instantly off, letting darkness flood in. Ranger stiffened too, tail rigid, ears pointing forward like twin compasses. The forest whispered, water dripping, branches creaking. But the sound Jack had caught was different, intentional, not an animal, not wind. A footstep. For several heartbeats they stood in the kind of silence that makes or breaks men. Jack's mind uncoiled into the cool clarity he hated and relied on. Every sound was a calculation. Every breath, a choice. Then, another sound. Farther away this time. Wet leaves being brushed aside. Something or someone moving just out of sight. Jack brought the flashlight back to life, aiming the narrow beam forward. The drag marks curved toward an old fence, half swallowed by ivy, one that marked the edge of Whispering Hollow's forgotten trails. Rust streaked the wire like old blood. A wooden sign dangled from a single nail, swinging in the wind. The letters were so faded it was almost unreadable, but Jack knew what it said. No trespassing. Yeah, he whispered bitterly. Never stopped monsters before. Ranger pawed at the ground, nose working furiously. He gave a short, low bark, his signal that the scent was strong. Jack's fingers brushed the cool metal of his flashlight. It felt like holding a weapon again. His heart hammered once, twice, then steadied. He'd seen too many trails like this in his life. Different landscapes, same darkness. Jack's mind flicked briefly to Emma's parents. He didn't know them personally, but he'd seen the father once at the mechanic's shop. A wiry man with the worn hands of someone who worked with tools. The kind of man who probably thought bad things happened to other people's kids. Not tonight. Jack took one slow breath. In that breath was every moment of his life that mattered. The red kite girl, the convoy, the hollow nights after discharge, and the way Ranger had sat beside him when he didn't trust the world. They crossed the fence. The air beyond was colder somehow. The hollow lived up to its name. Tall pines closed in like ribs of a beast, and the wind fell away as if sound itself had been swallowed. The beam of the flashlight flickered over tree trunks slick with moss, fallen logs like sleeping giants, and tracks, deep, fresh, ugly. Ranger's head swung left, then right, then forward, locking in. His breathing changed, heavier, purposeful. Jack's hand rested on the dog's back, steadying both of them. "You lead," he whispered. They moved deeper. The forest whispered around them. The drag marks were getting clearer, fresher. Jack could feel it, the invisible line they'd just crossed, between the part of the night where things could be fixed and the part where everything gets rewritten. His knuckles whitened around the flashlight. He thought of the girl. He thought of the boy 15 years ago. He thought of how this place didn't let go. And he understood one simple thing. There was no turning back now. The rain thinned into a fine, icy drizzle, the kind that clung to skin like a second, unwelcome breath. The forest around Whispering Hollow was still now. Too still. The storm's violence had passed, but its echo lived in the crooked branches, in the trembling of wet leaves. Somewhere ahead, through the dark, a faint yellow light blinked weakly against the storm's black belly. Jack Turner crouched low behind a fallen tree trunk, mud seeping into the seams of his jeans. Ranger was beside him, body pressed against the earth, ears flicking like radar dishes scanning for danger. The beam of the flashlight was off. Jack didn't need light now. Light would give them away. His heart beat hard, not with panic, but with that cold clarity he hadn't felt since the war. That sensation was as familiar as it was cruel. The quiet before an entry, the line between failure and survival. The light came from a shack, if it could be called that. The small structure leaned at an odd angle, its roof sagging like tired shoulders, planks mottled with moss and rot. Someone had strung up a kerosene lantern inside, its dull flame wavering through cracks in the wood. Water dripped steadily from the eaves, forming shallow puddles around the door. Jack edged closer, every movement controlled. Ranger mirrored him with that uncanny precision only years of training could forge. Through the warped slats of the wall, Jack saw movement. A man, tall and broad, shifting his weight inside. He was tying something. No, someone. Emma Collins sat on the floor, wrists bound with coarse rope, her pink raincoat dark and clinging to her small frame. Mud streaked her knees, and her hair, light brown and soaked, stuck to her pale face. Her eyes were wide, not just with fear, but with the wild alertness of someone who understood what danger meant, even if she couldn't name it. She was shivering, knees drawn slightly inward, but her chin was raised just a little, like she was refusing to disappear. The man bent over her. He was in his late 30s, though the lines on his face had carved themselves deep, making him look older. His beard was thick and black, with streaks of wet gray, framing a jaw that looked like it had never known softness. His hair hung to his collar, slick with rain and sweat, and his skin was ruddy beneath the grime. A dirty green jacket hung loose on his shoulders, patched in places, the sleeves frayed. His jeans were mud-caked, boots worn smooth. But it was his eyes that told the story Jack recognized all too well. Wild, hollow, and desperate. A man cornered not by soldiers or police, but by the ruin of his own mind. Jack had seen those eyes overseas, in villages, in men who'd already decided the world had nothing left for them. The kidnapper's hands were thick, scarred, moving with the hurried precision of someone who had tied too many knots in their life. He muttered under his breath, a low, guttural noise, more animal than speech. Jack couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. Ranger's muscles coiled beside him like a drawn spring. Jack laid a steadying hand on the dog's flank. His mind split itself into clean, efficient fragments. Distance to door, angle of approach, reaction time, wind direction, line of sight. It was terrifying how easily the old machine inside him switched on. This isn't a battlefield, he reminded himself. It's a little girl. And then again, a quieter truth. But the stakes are the same. A crack of thunder rolled far overhead, and in that moment the lantern light inside flickered. The man turned his back to the door, dragging Emma slightly across the floor. She whimpered, just once, but it was enough. Jack didn't hesitate. He breathed once, whispered the word only Ranger knew. Go. The door didn't creak. It exploded. Ranger hit it like a live round. Wood splintered inward with a sharp crack, shards flying. The dog surged through the opening with a snarl that belonged to something more ancient than training. A promise made between protector and prey. The man spun, eyes wide, but he was already too slow. Ranger's weight crashed into him, driving him back against the rickety table, the lantern wobbling dangerously. Jack was through the doorway a breath later. Everything went sharp. Ranger's teeth were bared, but controlled, aimed at the man's forearm. The kidnapper howled, twisting, trying to throw the dog off, but Ranger's training held. Perfect pressure, not to kill, but to immobilize. Jack crossed the distance in 3 strides. His boots splashed through muddy water pooled on the floor. He brought his shoulder into the man's chest with the precision of a breacher, slamming him against the wall. The sound was a dull, wet thud. The man swung wildly with his free hand, but Jack blocked it with the ease of someone who danced with worse monsters before. He shoved the man's wrist down, knee digging into his thigh. Ranger still latched with iron jaws. "Drop it," Jack growled, though the man wasn't holding anything. He said it anyway, because it wasn't about weapons. It was about power. The kidnapper spat out a broken laugh, bitter and cracked. "You think—" Jack drove him harder against the wall. "I don't think," he hissed. "I end this." The man sagged, breath wheezing out in a sour gust. Ranger finally released on command, teeth retracting like a switchblade sheathed. Jack grabbed the man's wrists and wrenched them behind his back, the movement fluid, practiced. The shack smelled of wet wood, rope, and human panic. Emma was still pressed against the floorboards, breathing hard, her small frame rigid. Jack's flashlight beam slid across her face, not to blind her, but to make sure she saw him. Not a stranger in the dark, a rescuer. Emma, he said softly, crouching now. My name's Jack. You're safe. I've got you. Her lower lip trembled. For a moment, she didn't move. Then very slowly, she nodded. Outside, thunder rolled again. Ranger stood over the subdued man, chest heaving, amber eyes bright. The bond between man and dog was silent, steady, forged long before this night. Jack's pulse slowed for the first time since the storm began. He pressed his radio's call button. This is Turner. Whispering Hollow Shack. I've got the girl. Suspect in custody. Lightning flashed through the cracked roof, painting the scene in white for half a second. The girl, the soldier, the dog, and the broken man who had thought the forest would keep his secrets. It hadn't. Wind screamed against the cliffside like a living thing. Rain lashed at the granite, slicking every surface with treachery. The trees of Whispering Hollow ended abruptly here, replaced by an open, jagged ledge that plunged into a black, endless drop. Far below, the storm churned through the ravine like some ancient, hungry throat. Jack Turner burst through the tree line a half-second too late. The kidnapper, blood streaking his temple from the fight in the shack, had Emma in a brutal grip, one arm locked around her narrow shoulders, the other holding a blade to her throat. He dragged her backward toward the very edge of the cliff, boots slipping on the wet stone but refusing to yield. Lui Lai, Tao Semang no Ji, he bellowed in a hoarse, broken voice, though the storm carried the words in ragged shreds. Jack froze 10 paces away, mud streaking his face, breath coming in short, deliberate pulls. His pulse roared in his ears, loud enough to drown out the storm. Emma's raincoat clung to her tiny frame like a wilted flag, her legs shaking beneath her, her eyes wide with terror. The knife, a long, rusted hunting blade, was pressed tight against her pale skin. Behind Jack, Ranger crouched low, chest brushing the mud, eyes burning amber through the rain. Every fiber of the dog's body screamed tension, his muscles coiled like a trap ready to spring. Jack's mind fractured, not into panic, but into the cold, surgical clarity that had kept him alive in places far worse than this. He measured everything in a heartbeat. Distance, 10 steps. Wind direction. Against him. Angle of attack. Narrow. The cliff behind them? Maybe 10 meters of jagged rock before it fell into nothing. Hey, Jack shouted, voice low but sharp, slicing through the rain. You don't want to do this. The man jerked Emma closer, his teeth bared in something between a grimace and a grin. You think I won't? His voice was a raw wound, full of fury, desperation, and something far older, ruin. Jack saw it clearly now. The man's face was twisted by more than rage. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, ringed with dark hollows. Whatever he'd been once, a worker, a neighbor, a human being, had been eroded by something relentless. Maybe addiction, maybe grief, maybe both. He wasn't a stranger to that kind of emptiness. Rain dripped from the man's tangled beard, down the blade, along Emma's trembling throat. She was trying not to cry, her lower lip bitten hard enough to draw blood. Let her go, Jack said softly, almost gently. This isn't the way out. Out? The man barked a bitter laugh, though his grip trembled ever so slightly. There's no out. There never was. They took everything. Everything. Jack's knuckles flexed at his sides. There it is, he thought, the fracture line. He recognized it. because it was the same kind of darkness that had once lived behind his own ribs. But this time, it wasn't going to swallow anyone else. He shifted his weight subtly to the left, eyes locked on the blade. You don't need to hurt her. She's just a kid. You can still walk away from this. Shut up, the man screamed, his voice cracking. The knife twitched closer to Emma's skin. She gasped, eyes squeezing shut. Ranger's growl was low and primal now, vibrating through the rain. The dog's gaze never left the man's forearm, the weak point. Jack didn't need to speak. Years of shared battlefields had built something stronger than commands. One breath, one signal. That was all they'd need. The wind whipped harder, howling across the cliff. Jack remembered Afghanistan. Dust storms tearing across the desert, adrenaline humming like a second heart. The split-second decisions that decided whether someone lived or didn't. Except now, the stakes weren't a soldier. It was a child. And for some reason, that terrified him more than any firefight ever had. Listen to me, Jack said quietly, taking one slow step forward. You don't want her blood on your hands, and you don't want to die out here tonight. The man's eyes twitched toward him, rage flickering with uncertainty. It was the only opening Jack needed. His voice dropped to the single word Ranger had been waiting for. Now. Ranger exploded from the mud like a shot fired from the dark. He crossed the gap in less than a breath, a streak of black and tan. The man barely had time to turn his head. Ranger clamped onto the knife arm with bone-crushing force, his weight slamming the kidnapper sideways. The blade scraped against rock, not skin. Emma stumbled forward with a sob as Jack lunged in. His shoulder hit the man's chest, driving him down into the mud. The knife skittered toward the cliff's edge, clanging against wet stone. Jack's fist slammed once, clean and brutal, into the man's jaw. Ranger held fast, growling, keeping the man pinned. For a terrifying second, the knife teetered on the cliff edge, spinning in the wind. Then it fell, vanishing into the darkness below. The man gasped under Jack's weight, mud streaking his face, his eyes wide but empty. All the fight had burned out of him. All that was left was a hollowed-out shell of a man who had taken a child into the woods and thought the storm would keep his secret. Jack's breath came hard and fast, but steady. His hands didn't shake. Ranger eased off at a sharp whistle, teeth still bared in silent warning. Emma stood a few feet away, rain soaking her hair, her little chest heaving. Jack turned to her slowly, raising his hands, not to touch, but to show her she was safe. It's over, he said softly. You're safe now. The wind howled through the ravine below, but above it, Jack heard something small and human. A sob, sharp and thin, breaking through the storm. Ranger padded toward Emma, tail low, ears slightly back. The dog gently pressed his wet muzzle against her hand. She didn't pull away. For the first time that night, Jack let his lungs fill fully. The cliff, the storm, the chaos. It was still there, but the worst of it had passed. The storm had begun to ease, but the rain still fell in cold, relentless sheets, slicking the ground into a treacherous skin of mud. The wind dragged mist across the cliffside, pulling at clothing and branches, carrying with it the last shreds of night's fury. Below, the ravine swallowed sound like a great black mouth. Above, a single sharp cry sliced through the storm. The kidnapper's boot slipped first. It was just half a step, a single misjudged shift on the wet slope, but it was enough. His arm jerked, the blade spinning out of his grip. For an instant, the knife caught a flash of lightning, a cold arc in the air, before vanishing into the abyss below. Jack Turner didn't wait. Years of training compressed into a single, instinctive movement. His body lunged forward like a coil released, boots digging deep into the mud for traction. He caught Emma around her small shoulders and yanked her backward into his chest with the kind of force that doesn't ask permission. Her raincoat was soaked, slippery, but his grip was iron. The kidnapper pitched forward, arms flailing, and in that sliver of chaos, Ranger moved. The German shepherd launched himself through the rain like a living thunderbolt, jaws locking onto the man's sleeve with perfect precision. The impact was low and brutal, spinning the man down into the ground. Mud splattered upward like an explosion. The sound of the man hitting the earth was heavy and final, a body meeting gravity with nothing left to bargain. Ranger growled low in his throat, a deep rumble that vibrated through the storm. His teeth held the man's arm like a steel trap, but his eyes never left Jack. That was how he had been trained, not to kill, not even to maim, but to end it. Jack dropped to one knee, holding Emma close. She was trembling against him, her thin frame shaking like a leaf caught in wind. Her hair, soaked and plastered to her cheeks, stuck to his sleeve as she buried her face into his jacket. He could feel her heartbeat through the layers of fabric, fast, sharp, alive. "It's okay," Jack whispered, though the storm didn't let words travel far. "I've got you. I've got you." For the first time since the night began, the sound of engines grew louder, rotors chopping the air. A white beam of light slashed down from above, sweeping across the treetops, the cliff, the mud-streaked faces below. A helicopter hovered over the clearing, its searchlight locking onto them like the eye of some mechanical angel. From the tree line, flashlights and shouts cut through the storm. Sheriff Tom Jenkins was the first to break into the open, broad-shouldered beneath a soaked rain jacket, his khaki uniform clinging to him. His gray hair was plastered to his temples, his flashlight shaking against the gusting wind. Years of field work carved steady lines around his mouth, and though his face was hard, his eyes flickered when they found Emma. "Jack!" he shouted, half over the roar of the rotor, blades. "You got her?" Jack nodded, his chest rising and falling hard, rainwater streaming down his face. "Yeah," he called back. "She's safe." Tom's boots sank deep into the mud as he approached. Two younger deputies flanked him. Officer Lewis, a wiry man with a close-cropped beard, and Deputy Carter, a woman in her early 30s with dark hair pulled into a wet braid. Both of their uniforms were soaked, their faces tight with adrenaline. The deputies rushed forward with cuffs. The kidnapper, still pinned beneath Ranger, thrashed weakly, but the fight had already bled out of him. His face was streaked with mud, hair hanging in wet ropes around hollow eyes. His breathing came in sharp, frantic bursts. "Easy," Tom said, voice low but edged like steel. "He's done." Jack gave Ranger a short whistle. The dog loosened his grip and stepped back with the deliberate grace of a trained soldier, his chest rising and falling steadily. Mud streaked his legs and muzzle, but his amber eyes remained locked on the man. Even soaked, Ranger stood like a wall between Emma and the world. Deputy Carter cuffed the man, pressing his face into the mud without a hint of hesitation. Lewis retrieved a discarded rope near the ledge, evidence of something darker perhaps, but neither spoke. They didn't need to. The sound of the cuffs clicking was enough. Emma's small hands clutched at Jack's jacket. She wasn't crying in the loud, panicked way children often did. Her sobs were silent, pressed deep into him. each one a tremor he could feel more than hear. He didn't speak again. Words didn't help now. What mattered was warmth, presence, the steady beat of another heart. Sheriff Tom knelt beside them, his breath steaming in the cold air. "We've got an ambulance staged down the road," he said softly. "We'll get her warm. She's gonna be okay." Jack nodded, but something in his chest twisted. He'd been here before. Different faces, different soil, the same desperate edge. But this time, it wasn't a war. This was home, and that made it heavier. The helicopter's light swept across the ledge once more. Mud shone like black glass. Rain sparkled on Ranger's coat. For a heartbeat, the whole night froze in the blinding white beam. The soldier, the dog, the child, the broken man, and the sheriff standing against the storm. Ranger shifted closer, pressing his wet fur against Jack's knee. It wasn't a grand gesture. It never was. But it said everything Jack couldn't. Somewhere in the distance, the storm finally began to break. The morning sunlight spilled gently over Pine Hollow, warm and golden, pooling along the cobblestone sidewalk like honey. Outside, autumn leaves swirled lazily in the breeze, brushing against the windows of a small cafe painted a soft forest green. Above the door, hand-carved wooden letters spelled out the name, Ranger's Place. Jack Turner wiped down the counter with slow, even movements, the kind that came from both habit and a quiet sense of purpose. He wore a faded work shirt rolled to the elbows, his beard now a little more silver at the chin. Time hadn't softened him, not exactly, but it had settled around him like sunlight on an old fence. His frame was still lean and strong, the posture of a man who could never quite let go of the discipline he'd been forged with. On one side of the shop, the faint scent of fresh coffee mingled with the oil and rubber of the small auto repair bay he had built behind the cafe. It was an odd mix, wrenches and cappuccinos, but somehow, here, it fit. Locals said the smell itself had a story to tell. Ranger lay near the front door, his thick black and tan fur gleaming beneath the soft glow of morning light. He was older now, 8, but his build remained proud, powerful, his amber eyes as sharp as the day he'd leapt into the storm. A red bandana rested loosely around his neck, embroidered with his name. Every so often, a customer would stop at the door, scratch his ears, and Ranger would respond with a slow wag of his tail. Not overjoyed, not timid, but steady. He was a sentinel who had chosen peace, but never forgotten war. The bell above the door chimed softly as the morning regulars drifted in. There was Martha Green, a retired nurse in her late 60s, her gray hair tied neatly into a bun, wrapped in a knitted shawl the color of cloudlight. She always ordered the same thing, black coffee with a touch of cinnamon, and left exact change in a little ceramic bowl on the counter. She liked to sit near the wood stove, hands wrapped around her cup, listening to the quiet chatter. Then came Tom Jenkins, no longer sheriff, but still carrying that solid, immovable presence of a man who had spent his life standing between people and trouble. His hair was whiter now, his rain jacket replaced by a plaid flannel. He always sat at the corner table with the best view of Main Street, nursing a cup of dark roast and nodding at Jack like men who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Jack greeted each with the same quiet warmth. He wasn't much for words, but people didn't come to Ranger's Place for speeches. They came for the silence that felt like safety. The bell chimed again. Emma Collins pushed the door open, her school bag bouncing against her side. She was 9 now, taller, her light brown hair tied back in a messy ponytail. Her cheeks still carried the softness of childhood, but there was a brightness in her eyes that hadn't been there the night of the storm. She wore a blue hoodie with little stars on the sleeves, scuffed sneakers, and the wide grin of someone who had found solid ground again. "Hey, kid," Jack said quietly. "Hi, Jack. Hi, Ranger." She dropped her bag onto a chair by the window, the same window she always chose, and went straight to the dog. Ranger stretched forward, head pressing against her chest. Emma laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. It wasn't the careful, frightened touch of a child who needed protecting anymore. It was the full-bodied hug of someone who trusted. She sat down at the window, pulling out colored pencils and a folded sheet of paper. Jack brewed her usual hot chocolate without needing to ask. The cafe hummed with low voices and the gentle hiss of the espresso machine. Sunlight warmed the wood floors. For a moment, everything in Pine Hollow felt still. Not the stillness of fear, but the kind born of healing. Emma finished her drawing and walked shyly up to the counter. "I made something," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Jack dried his hands on a towel. "Yeah?" She unfolded the paper. The drawing showed 3 figures, Jack, Ranger, and herself, standing in front of the cafe, the sun behind them like a golden crown. Underneath, in her neat, careful handwriting, were the words, "Because of you, I found my way home." For a long second, Jack didn't speak. He just looked at the drawing, the uneven crayon lines, the small details, Ranger's red bandana, the window where she always sat. Something tight uncoiled in his chest, a knot he hadn't realized was still there. Emma tilted her head, uncertain. "Do you like it?" Jack cleared his throat, a sound rougher than he intended. "Yeah, kid," he said softly. "Yeah, I do." He walked to the wall behind the counter, a patch of clean wood he'd left empty since the day he opened the cafe. He tacked the drawing right in the center. Sunlight poured in through the window and caught the crayon colors, making them glow. Martha smiled from her corner. Tom gave a quiet nod. Ranger let out a low huff and settled by Emma's chair, as if he too approved. Jack stood back, hands on his hips, watching the drawing with a small, quiet smile. A year ago, he had thought the best parts of his life were behind him. But somehow, without warning, they'd walked through his door in the shape of a frightened little girl and a storm. Now, the light in the cafe was warm. The town felt smaller in the best way, and for the first time in years, Jack Turner felt at home. In the quiet town of Pine Hollow, a storm once tore through the night and carried with it a story that would change many lives. It began with fear, a missing girl, a broken man, a loyal dog. It grew into courage, a soldier who thought his war was over, standing again on the edge of darkness. And it ended with light, a warm cafe, a child's laughter, and a town that learned how to hold each other a little closer. Jack Turner didn't set out to be a hero. He was just a man who had lost too much and learned to live in silence. But love has a way of finding cracks in even the hardest armor. Ranger reminded the town that loyalty is a language without words. Emma reminded everyone that innocence, when protected, can bloom again. And the people of Pine Hollow remembered what it meant to come together when it matters most. Sometimes, miracles don't come with trumpets or halos. They come quietly, in the form of a loyal dog, a helping hand, or a stranger who refuses to walk away. I believe those moments are whispers from God, gently reminding us that light is never truly lost. If this story touched your heart, share it, leave a comment, subscribe, and let's spread kindness together. And tonight, as you close your eyes, take a moment to pray, not just for yourself, but for the world around you. May God bless you and keep you safe. May His light guide your steps, just as it guided Jack, Ranger, and Emma home.